Today, I'm going to be making an updated video on how to achieve Daft Punk style vocoder vocals using the Electrix WarpFactory. So before we get into it, here are the actual settings that I have set on my Electrix WarpFactory itself. I've got the formant turned down just a little bit to match the formant shifting on the talkbox preset on the Digitech talker. I have the Q set all the way to the left, the order set all the way to the left, the internal oscillators turned off, effects mix all the way up, source kill on, and when it comes to the actual source selection, I have it set to S off because we're using the Sennheiser vocoder emulation to substitute for the S sounds. So now I'm going to show you the effect settings I use to get the WarpFactory to sound more like the Digitech talker. So one thing that I learned to do that definitely helps get a bit closer is EQ matching the WarpFactory to the Digitech talker itself. I didn't used to do this. Usually, I would just record my vocals, adjust the formant to fit how I thought it sounded good, and then I would EQ it and mix it. But what I decided to do recently was take a couple audio examples recorded from the Digitech talker, specifically with the talkbox preset, because it has this sort of specific EQ on it. And I wanted to EQ match that to the WarpFactory to get my WarpFactory to sound like the Digitech talker. So this is the EQ match right here. Pretty much, it's just taking out, a bit of low end, boosting some mid frequencies. And then I've got just a second EQ just to take out a little bit of the mids because I honestly really felt like it needed that. Maybe it's just specifically with my microphone, my voice, whatever. I thought that's what sounded best. It might differ for you depending on a different mic that you use or how your voice sounds in the microphone. So that's pretty much it for just the effects on the WarpFactory track. I've also got like a gate there, but that doesn't really matter. For the modulator track, the only reason I have a reverb inserted on there is because I've got these really cool IRs that I bought like a year ago from Past to Future reverbs or samples. It's these IRs that can make your SM58 style microphone sound somewhat like a U87. It's really cool. I always use it on my microphone recordings. It sounds great. And for the synthesizer that I use for the carrier track, I decided to stick to Vital because it's my favorite free synth. And if you haven't used it before, you should check it out. So yeah, it's just like a basic sawtooth. It's nothing really else to it. So that's it for the bass vocoder sound. Now, what I noticed that Daft Punk does on specifically the Ram album, and even moving forward on tracks like Gust of Wind from Pharrell, what they seem to be doing is not only running the vocoder through what sounds to be their Digitech talker, but they also seem to be running the same modulator track into their Sennheiser vocoder and using only the consonant sounds or the S sounds and overlaying that on top of the talker. And I wanted to try replicating that. So what I've done here is I've got an instance of Autotune Vocodist and I've got it set to the Sennheiser model. I've tweaked the settings a bit. If you want to copy them on screen here, you can. But because this plugin doesn't really have an S only feature, what I did do is I set the balance on the noise to 100. And then I tricked the vocoder into only really outputting the S sounds by feeding it this tone generator, which has like a super, super high sine wave. And then I'm just EQing it out with this little peak here. In this instance of fab filter so that you can't really hear it and it only really lets the S sounds through. And for the EQ on that, I really only got, basically just like EQing some extra low end out just to be safe. And then I've also got this dip in high end. And the reason I did that is because on this instance of ReaEQ that I've got on the vocoder bus, I've got like a 5 dB boost of high end. And in order to make sure that the S sounds don't get too hyped up, I've inserted that little dip on the VSM Ess Track to make sure that it doesn't get too harsh in the high end. And then I've just sort of EQ'd some mid lows out. I've got a little roll off on the low end so it doesn't get too muddy. Then I've got a CLA 76 because I've heard that on random access memories, typically an 1176 was used on the Robots tracks. And then this second EQ that I've got here isn't really necessary. I just added it because I didn't feel like tweaking the first instance of the EQ anymore because I've already got a ton of bands here. So I just thought I would insert this secondary EQ and just do a little bit more touching up, especially in the sort of mid-lows. And yeah, that is really it. It's not a lot to it compared to the old setup I had. I'm definitely a lot more happier with this setup. I just think it sounds a whole lot nicer than how I used to do it. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope this was helpful. If you have any other questions, please leave them down below in the comments. I will try to answer them as soon as possible. Let me know if there's anything you'd like to see me post next in the future. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you all later.